Maria Santos never imagined that a simple photograph would lead her into the most dangerous 48 hours of her life. As a war correspondent, she had covered conflicts across 3 continents. But nothing prepared her for what happened when she crossed into rebel territory with nothing but her camera, 1 magazine of ammunition, and a promise she made to a dying mother. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the abandoned village as 40 armed soldiers surrounded the small building where she had taken shelter. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she counted the shadows moving past the cracked windows. The magazine in her pistol held only 15 rounds. The math was simple and terrifying. But Maria had come too far to turn back now. Somewhere in this war-torn region was a little girl whose mother had pressed a torn photograph into Maria's hands 3 days earlier, begging her with dying breaths to find her daughter. The woman's last words still haunted her. "Promise me you'll bring her home." What started as a humanitarian mission was about to become a deadly game of survival that would test every skill Maria had learned in 20 years of reporting from the world's most dangerous places. She had no way of knowing that her decision to honor a stranger's dying wish would soon make headlines around the world and change the lives of everyone involved. The soldiers were getting closer. Maria checked her weapon one more time and whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. In moments like these, the line between life and death becomes razor thin, and one wrong move could mean the difference between completing her mission or becoming another casualty of war. This is the true story of how one woman's courage in the face of impossible odds turned a desperate search into an international rescue operation that captivated the world. Maria Santos had seen death before, but nothing prepared her for the way Elena Vasquez looked at her in those final moments. The wounded woman lay in the makeshift medical tent, her clothes torn and bloodied from the explosion that had ripped through the refugee camp just hours earlier. Around them, the chaos of war continued its relentless march, but in that small space between canvas walls, time seemed to slow down. Elena's fingers trembled as she reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out a crumpled photograph. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling, and a long crack ran down the middle where someone had tried to tape it back together. In the picture, a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile looked back at them, her arms wrapped around a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. "Her name is Carmen," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of gunfire. "She's 8 years old now, maybe 9. I lost count of the months since they took her." Maria leaned closer, studying the photograph. She had spent the last 3 weeks documenting the refugee crisis in this forgotten corner of the world, where civil war had torn apart families and scattered children like leaves in the wind. She had interviewed dozens of parents searching for lost children, but something about Elena's desperation cut deeper than the rest. "Where was she taken?" Maria asked gently, already knowing that the answer would complicate everything. Elena's eyes filled with tears that she no longer had the strength to shed. "North, beyond the checkpoint, in rebel territory." She gripped Maria's wrist with surprising strength. "They said she was being kept with other children in an old school building. But that was 6 months ago. I don't know if she's still alive." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Everyone knew that crossing into rebel territory was suicide for a journalist. The northern region had become a lawless wasteland where armed groups fought for control of drug routes and mining operations. Foreign reporters who ventured there rarely returned, and when they did, it was usually in body bags. Dr. Martinez, the head of the medical unit, appeared at Elena's bedside with a grim expression. He had been working without sleep for 36 hours, trying to save what remained of the families caught in the latest bombing. One look at his face told Maria everything she needed to know about Elena's condition. "How long does she have?" Maria asked quietly. "Hours, maybe less," he replied, checking Elena's pulse with practiced efficiency. "The internal bleeding is too severe. We don't have the equipment here to operate." Elena must have heard because her grip on Maria's wrist tightened. "Promise me," she said, her voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside her failing body. "Promise me you'll find her. Promise me you'll bring Carmen home." Maria stared at the photograph, memorizing every detail of the little girl's face. She thought about her own daughter back in New York, safe in their apartment overlooking Central Park. She thought about the comfortable life she could return to after filing her story about the refugee crisis. She thought about all the reasons why what Elena was asking was impossible. "I promise," she heard herself say. Elena's face relaxed for the first time since Maria had met her. A smile flickered across her lips, and, for a moment, she looked like the young mother in the background of the photograph, pushing her daughter on a swing in happier times. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me peace." Those were the last words Elena Vasquez ever spoke. She died 20 minutes later, still clutching the photograph of her daughter. Maria sat beside the body for a long time, staring at the picture that had somehow become her responsibility. Around her, the medical tent buzzed with activity as doctors and nurses moved between patients, fighting to save lives in an impossible situation. But Maria felt disconnected from it all, trapped in the weight of a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Dr. Martinez found her there an hour later, still holding the photograph. "You can't be serious about this," he said, recognizing the look in her eyes. "The northern region is controlled by Commander Ramirez's militia. They execute journalists for sport. I've covered wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia," Maria replied, tucking the photograph into her jacket pocket. "I've been shot at before." "This is different," Dr. Martinez insisted. "Ramirez isn't fighting for ideology or religion. He's running a criminal empire. To him, a foreign journalist is either a spy or a source of ransom money. Either way, you're dead." Maria understood the risks better than most people realized. She had spent 20 years building sources in some of the world's most dangerous places, learning to navigate the complex web of alliances and betrayals that defined modern warfare. She knew that crossing into rebel territory would require more than just courage. It would require luck, preparation, and a miracle. But the photograph in her pocket felt like it was burning against her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elena's face in those final moments, the desperate hope that someone would care enough about her daughter to risk everything. Maria had made a career out of telling other people's stories, but this felt different. This felt personal. That night, she began making phone calls. Her first call was to James Crawford, a former British Special Forces operator who now worked as a security consultant for news organizations operating in hostile territories. If anyone could help her plan a route into rebel-controlled areas, it would be James. "You're out of your bloody mind," was his immediate response when she explained what she wanted to do. "I've lost 3 clients in that region in the past year. Good operators, people who knew what they were doing." "I'm not asking you to come with me," Maria said. "I just need intelligence. Safe houses, contact points, routes that might be less heavily guarded." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why?" James asked finally. "Why risk everything for one child when there are thousands of others in the same situation?" Maria looked at the photograph spread out on her hotel room desk. Carmen Vasquez smiled back at her, frozen in a moment of childhood innocence that felt like a lifetime ago. "Because sometimes one life is all you can save," she said. James sighed heavily. "Give me 48 hours. I'll see what I can dig up." Her second call was to her editor at the International Herald Tribune. Sarah Chun had been her boss for 8 years, and she knew Maria well enough to recognize when her star correspondent was about to do something stupid. "Absolutely not," Sarah said before Maria had finished explaining her plan. "I'm not authorizing a solo mission into rebel territory. It's suicide, and you know it." "Then, I'll take vacation time," Maria replied. "This isn't negotiable, Sarah. I made a promise to a dying woman." "Promises to dying people don't count if you end up dead trying to keep them," Sarah shot back. "Be reasonable, Maria. File your refugee story and come home. Let the Red Cross handle missing children cases." But Maria had already made up her mind. She hung up the phone and began going through her equipment, checking and rechecking everything she would need for the journey ahead. Her Kevlar vest, portable satellite phone, first aid kit, and the Glock 19 pistol she had carried in every war zone for the past decade. She counted the ammunition carefully. 1 magazine with 15 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was all she could carry without attracting attention at checkpoints. In rebel territory, being caught with too many weapons would mark her as a combatant rather than a journalist. The difference could mean the difference between interrogation and execution. 3 days later, James called back with a detailed briefing that made her blood run cold. The northern region was controlled by 3 different militia groups, all fighting each other for territory. Commander Ramirez's forces controlled the main highways and the old school building where Carmen was reportedly being held. Getting there would require passing through at least 2 checkpoints and crossing 20 miles of contested territory where firefights broke out daily. There's a village called San Pedro about 15 kilometers from the school, James explained. My sources say there's a Catholic priest there who sometimes helps people cross the lines. Father Miguel. If he's still alive, he might be able to get you close. And if he's not, then you turn around and come back. This isn't worth dying for, Maria. But as Maria stared at Carmen's photograph, she knew that turning back was no longer an option. Elena Vasquez had died believing that someone would care enough about her daughter to risk everything. Maria had given her word, and in 20 years of journalism, her word had been the only thing that kept her alive and credible in the world's worst places. The first checkpoint appeared through the heat haze like a mirage, but the AK-47 rifles pointing in her direction were real enough. Maria slowed her Jeep to a crawl, raising her hands to show she was unarmed while keeping her press credentials visible on the dashboard. 3 men in mismatched military fatigues approached her vehicle, their faces hidden behind bandanas and sunglasses. Periodista, she called out in Spanish, using the word that had saved her life in a dozen different countries. Journalist. International press. The leader, a thin man with neck tattoos and gold teeth, examined her credentials with the suspicion of someone who couldn't read well but wasn't about to admit it. He spoke rapid Spanish to his companions, then turned back to Maria with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You pay toll, he said in broken English. $100. American. Maria had expected this. Checkpoint taxes were a fact of life in rebel territory, where every armed group needed to fund their operations. She handed over 5 $20 bills, knowing that arguing would only draw unwanted attention. Where you go? The man asked, pocketing the money. North. To document the humanitarian situation, Maria replied, sticking to the cover story she had prepared. To show the world what is happening here. The soldier laughed and said something that made his companions chuckle. Maria didn't need to understand Spanish to know they were joking about her chances of survival. The leader waved her through with a dismissive gesture, already turning his attention to the next vehicle in line. As Maria drove away from the checkpoint, she noticed movement in her side mirrors. A pickup truck with 2 men in the back had pulled out of the checkpoint behind her and was following at a distance. Her heart rate picked up, but she forced herself to maintain a steady speed. In hostile territory, appearing nervous could be interpreted as guilt. The road deteriorated quickly once she left the checkpoint behind. What had been poorly maintained asphalt became a dirt track full of potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. The landscape around her was a study in desolation. Abandoned farmhouses with bullet-scarred walls, rusted vehicles stripped of anything valuable, and mile after mile of scrubland dotted with the black scars of old explosions. The pickup truck stayed with her for 10 kilometers before turning off onto a side road. Maria allowed herself a moment of relief, but she knew this was only the beginning. According to James's intelligence, she would encounter at least 2 more checkpoints before reaching San Pedro, and each one would be more dangerous than the last. The second checkpoint was manned by a different group entirely. These soldiers wore newer equipment and moved with military precision that suggested formal training. Their commander, a heavy-set man with sergeant stripes, studied Maria's documents for a long time before speaking. You are the American journalist, he said in perfect English. We have been expecting you. Maria felt ice water flow through her veins. If they knew she was coming, it meant someone had been talking. Either her satellite phone calls had been intercepted or one of James's sources had compromised her mission. In either case, she was now a marked woman traveling through territory controlled by people who had every reason to kill her. I'm here to document the refugee crisis, she said, maintaining her cover story. To show the international community what support is needed. The commander nodded slowly. Of course, you will document what we allow you to document. Nothing more. He gestured to one of his men. Corporal Santos will accompany you. For your protection. Maria's mind raced. Having a government escort would make it impossible to search for Carmen without exposing her real mission. But Refusing the offer would immediately mark her as suspicious. She needed time to think, to find a way to lose her unwanted shadow. "Thank you for your consideration," she said. "But I work alone. My insurance requires it." The commander's eyes hardened. "This is not a request, Señorita Santos. Corporal Santos will ensure your safety. The northern region can be very dangerous for foreign visitors." 20 minutes later, Maria found herself driving with a silent young soldier in her passenger seat. Corporal Santos looked barely old enough to shave, but the way he handled his rifle suggested he knew how to use it. He gave her directions to the next checkpoint in monosyllabic responses, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain around them. The third checkpoint was the worst yet. It was manned by Commander Ramirez's militia, the same group that reportedly controlled the school where Carmen was being held. The soldiers here moved like predators, examining every vehicle with the thoroughness of people who killed first and asked questions later. The checkpoint commander was a woman in her 40s with dead eyes and scars that suggested she had fought her way to her current position. She took one look at Corporal Santos and began speaking rapid Spanish that Maria couldn't follow. The conversation grew heated, with both soldiers gesturing angrily. "Problem," Santos whispered to Maria. "She says journalists not allowed past this point." "Military orders." Maria stepped out of the jeep and approached the female commander with her hands visible. "Comandante," she said in Spanish, using the formal title. "I request permission to continue north. I am documenting the humanitarian crisis for the international community." The woman looked her up and down with unconcealed hostility. "You document what we tell you to document," she said in accented English. "Or you go back south. Your choice." "I understand," Maria replied. "I only want to help tell the story of what is happening here." After another rapid conversation in Spanish, the commander grudgingly allowed them to pass. But Maria noticed that she used a radio to report their passage to someone else. Within minutes of leaving the checkpoint, Maria spotted two motorcycles in her rearview mirror, maintaining a careful distance but clearly following them. The village of San Pedro appeared just before sunset, a cluster of adobe buildings surrounded by a low stone wall. Smoke rose from several chimneys, suggesting that despite the war raging around them, some families were still trying to maintain normal lives. Maria parked near what appeared to be the village church, a small building with a bell tower that had been damaged by shrapnel. "We stay here tonight," Santos announced. "Tomorrow we go back." Maria nodded, but her mind was already working on the problem of how to contact Father Miguel without alerting her escort. As they approached the church, an elderly priest emerged from the shadows near the entrance. He was a small man with kind eyes and hands stained with dirt from working in a garden behind the building. "Welcome, travelers," he said in Spanish. "I am Father Miguel. You are welcome to shelter here tonight." Maria felt a surge of hope. This was the contact James had mentioned, the priest who sometimes helped people cross the lines between warring factions. But with Santos watching her every move, she needed to find a way to speak with the priest privately. The solution came unexpectedly when Santos excused himself to use the facilities behind the church. Maria immediately approached Father Miguel, speaking quickly in Spanish. "Father, I need your help. I'm looking for a child who was taken by Ramirez's forces. A little girl named Carmen Vasquez." The priest's eyes widened with recognition. "Ah, see. The daughter of Elena. We heard she was taken to the old school." His face grew sad. "Many children have disappeared. It is a terrible thing. Can you help me reach the school? I made a promise to her mother before she died." Father Miguel glanced toward the back of the church where Santos had disappeared. "Your friend? He is not really your friend, no?" "No. He's watching me for the military." The priest nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it is very dangerous. The school is heavily guarded, and Ramirez's men shoot strangers on sight." "I have to try," Maria said urgently. "I gave my word." Before Father Miguel could respond, Santos reappeared, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The conversation ended abruptly, but the priest caught Maria's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the bell tower. That night, Maria lay on a simple cot in the church's guest quarters, listening to Santos's breathing in the next room. When she was certain he was asleep, she slipped out of bed and made her way quietly to the bell tower. Father Miguel was waiting for her, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. The school is 5 kilometers north, he whispered. But you cannot reach it by road. Too many patrols. There is an old mining trail through the hills, but it is treacherous at night. I'll manage, Maria said. What about guards at the school? At least 20 men, maybe more. They use the children as workers in the drug labs. It is slavery, nothing more. Maria felt sick. The idea that Carmen might be forced to work in methamphetamine production added another layer of urgency to her mission. Children exposed to those chemicals often suffered permanent health damage. Father Miguel pressed a small object into her hands. This will help, he said. It was a two-way radio, old but functional. Channel 7. If you find the child, call for help. I have friends who can meet you at the border. What about Santos? I will handle your escort. He will sleep very deeply tonight. The priest's smile was grim. Sometimes even priests must bend the rules to serve God's justice. Maria understood. Father Miguel had drugged Santos's food or water to ensure he wouldn't wake up until morning. It would give her several hours head start, but it would also make it clear that she had help from the village. When Santos woke up, both she and the priest would be in danger. Father, you should leave with me. They'll kill you when they realize what happened. My place is here, he replied simply. These people need their priest. But you must go now. Every minute counts. Maria retrieved her equipment from the jeep, including her Kevlar vest and the Glock 19 with its single magazine of ammunition. She also took her camera equipment, maintaining the fiction that she was still a journalist documenting the conflict. If captured, the camera gear might buy her a few extra seconds of life. The mining trail Father Miguel had described was barely visible in the darkness, a narrow path that wound through rocky hills covered with thorny brush. Maria used a small flashlight to pick her way carefully along the treacherous route, knowing that a twisted ankle or broken leg would doom her mission before it started. 2 hours into her journey, she heard the distant sound of engines behind her. Flashlight beams swept the hillsides as search parties began combing the area around San Pedro. Santos had awakened early, or Father Miguel's sedative hadn't worked as planned. Either way, she was now being actively hunted. Maria turned off her flashlight and continued navigating by St. The opportunity came at exactly 7:30 in the morning, just as Maria had calculated from watching the guard rotations. The rear patrol had moved around the eastern corner of the building, and the tower guard was lighting a cigarette, his attention focused on his lighter rather than the perimeter. Maria had exactly 90 seconds to cross 30 meters of open ground and reach the chain-link fence. She sprinted from the rocky outcropping where she had been hiding, her equipment bag bouncing against her back with every step. The fence was 8 feet high and topped with razor wire, but Maria had come prepared. She pulled a small wire cutter from her bag and quickly snipped a hole large enough to crawl through, ignoring the sharp metal that tore at her clothing. Inside the compound, she could hear voices coming from the main building, children's voices mixed with harsh commands in Spanish. The sound made her stomach clench with rage. These were supposed to be kids playing in schoolyards, not working in drug labs under armed guard. The rear entrance to the building was secured with a simple padlock. Maria used her knife to pry at the metal hasp until it gave way with a soft crack. The door swung open on rusty hinges, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of chemicals and fear. She moved carefully down the corridor, her pistol drawn but held low. Through classroom doors, she could see the horror that Father Miguel had described. Children as young as 6 were seated at long tables, carefully packaging white powder into small plastic bags under the supervision of armed guards. Their faces were gaunt and their movements mechanical, like robots programmed to perform repetitive tasks. Maria photographed everything with her digital camera, knowing that even if she didn't survive, the images might eventually reach the outside world and expose what was happening here. But photography wasn't her primary mission. She was looking for one specific child among the dozens imprisoned in this nightmare. She found Carmen on the 2nd floor, in a room that had once been a library. The little girl was sitting alone at a small table, slowly folding cardboard boxes that would be used to ship the finished drugs. She looked exactly like the photograph her mother had shown Maria, but thinner and older, with dark circles under her eyes that no 8-year-old should ever have. Carmen, Maria whispered from the doorway. The child looked up with the cautious expression of someone who had learned not to trust adults. When she saw Maria's foreign features and press credentials, confusion flickered across her face. "Who are you?" Carmen asked in Spanish, her voice barely audible. "I'm a friend of your mother's," Maria replied, approaching slowly with her hands visible. "Elena sent me to bring you home." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "Mama is here? Where is she?" Maria's heart broke. The child didn't know that her mother was dead, and there was no gentle way to explain what had happened. But before she could figure out what to say, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy boots, moving with military precision. "We have to go? Right now," Maria whispered urgently, extending her hand to Carmen. But Carmen shrank back, shaking her head. "I can't leave. They said they'll hurt the other children if anyone tries to escape." Maria looked around the room and saw what Carmen meant. Two other children, a boy and girl who couldn't have been older than 10, were chained to their work tables. They watched the conversation with desperate hope, but their restraints made it clear that attempting to free them would take too much time. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. Maria had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she saved one child, tried to save 3 and possibly lost them all, or abandoned her mission entirely. She chose a fourth option. "Listen to me carefully," she told Carmen. "I'm going to create a distraction. When you hear fighting, you and your friends hide under those tables, and don't come out until I call for you. Do you understand?" Carmen nodded, intelligence shining in her young eyes despite everything she had endured. Maria positioned herself behind the door and waited. When the first guard entered the room, she struck him in the throat with the butt of her pistol. He went down silently, his rifle clattering to the floor. But his partner was right behind him, and this one had time to shout an alarm before Maria's second blow sent him sprawling. The shouts brought more soldiers running. Maria heard boots pounding on stairs and voices calling out coordinates in military Spanish. She had perhaps minutes before the entire compound descended on their location. Working quickly, she freed the other 2 children from their chains using the keys from the unconscious guard's belt. All 3 kids huddled under the tables as Maria positioned herself near the window, checking her weapon. 15 rounds. Against how many armed soldiers? The first group to reach the second floor approached cautiously, having heard the initial alarm. Maria waited until they were bunched in the narrow hallway before opening fire. Her first 3 shots dropped 2 men and sent the others diving for cover. But their return fire splintered the door frame where she was hiding and sent wood splinters flying across the room. "Stay down," she shouted to the children as bullets whined overhead. Through the window, Maria could see soldiers pouring out of barracks buildings she hadn't noticed during her initial reconnaissance. They were surrounding the main building, cutting off any possible escape routes. Her count reached 20, then 30, then 40 armed men taking positions around the school. The radio Father Miguel had given her crackled to life. "Phoenix, Phoenix, this is Sanctuary," came the priest's voice. "Do you copy?" Maria grabbed the radio while reloading her pistol. "This is Phoenix. I've got 3 children, but we're pinned down. Estimate 40 hostiles. Repeat, 40 hostiles surrounding our position." "Understood, Phoenix. Help is coming. Hold your position." But holding their position was easier said than done. The soldiers had regrouped and were advancing up both stairwells, coordinating their assault with military precision. Maria realized that these weren't just bandits or irregulars. They were trained fighters, possibly former government forces who had defected to Ramirez's organization. Her next exchange of gunfire used 5 more rounds and bought them perhaps 2 minutes before the soldiers adapted their tactics. 7 bullets left against 40 armed men. The math was becoming impossible. "Senora," Carmen called from under her table. "There's another way out. The old coal chute in the basement. It connects to tunnels." Maria looked at the child with new respect. Carmen had been imprisoned here for months, but she had been observing, learning, preparing for an opportunity like this. "Can you find it?" "Yes, but we have to go through the kitchen." The kitchen was on the first floor, which meant crossing ground that was certainly crawling with soldiers by now. But staying in their current position meant certain death once the attackers coordinated their final assault. "Okay," Maria decided. "When I say run, you 3 head for the stairs." Stay low and move fast. She fired her remaining 7 rounds down the hallway, emptying her magazine to force the advancing soldiers back behind cover. The sudden intensity of gunfire created the illusion that she had more ammunition than she actually did, buying them precious seconds. "Run!" she shouted. The children scrambled from under the tables and raced toward the stairwell. Maria followed, using her empty pistol as a club when one soldier tried to grab Carmen. Her blow sent him tumbling down the stairs, but alerted every other fighter in the building to their exact location. The kitchen was chaos. Soldiers were pouring through the main entrance while others climbed through windows. Maria grabbed a large knife from the counter and gestured for the children to follow her toward what looked like a storage closet. Carmen led them to a small metal door built into the floor, the entrance to the old coal delivery system. The tunnel beyond was barely large enough for an adult to crawl through, but it represented their only chance of escape. "Go," Maria ordered, pushing the children into the tunnel ahead of her. As she squeezed into the narrow passage, gunfire erupted in the kitchen behind them. Soldiers had discovered their escape route and were firing blindly into the tunnel. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, creating sparks and stone chips that stung like wasps. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of stone and darkness. Carmen led the way with the confidence of someone who had explored every inch of her prison, while the other 2 children followed close behind. Maria brought up the rear, listening to the sounds of pursuit echoing through the passage. They emerged in a storm drain 100 meters from the main building. Daylight had never looked so beautiful, but their escape was far from over. The sound of engines and shouting voices filled the air as Ramirez's forces organized search parties to comb the surrounding area. Maria keyed her radio. "Sanctuary, this is Phoenix. We're outside the building but still inside the perimeter. 3 packages secure. Request immediate extraction." Father Miguel's voice came back strained. "Phoenix, extraction team is 2 kilometers south of your position. Can you reach the old cemetery?" Maria looked around, trying to orient herself. The cemetery was visible on a hillside to the south, but getting there would require crossing open ground while being hunted by 40 armed soldiers who now knew exactly what she looked like. "We'll try," she replied. Carmen tugged at her sleeve. "Senora, there are more tunnels. From the old mine. They go all the way to the cemetery." For the second time that day, Maria marveled at this child's courage and intelligence. Carmen had survived 6 months in hell by being observant and resourceful. She knew things about this area that even the soldiers might not know. "Show me," Maria said. They spent the next hour crawling through a network of abandoned mine shafts that connected the school compound to the hillside cemetery. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with the bones of small animals, but they provided concealment from the search parties that were systematically combing the surface. When they finally emerged among the weathered headstones of the cemetery, Maria could see a black SUV waiting near the entrance road. 3 men in civilian clothes stood beside it, scanning the hills with binoculars. These had to be the extraction team Father Miguel had promised. But between the cemetery and the road stood the final obstacle, an open field where they would be completely exposed for at least 2 minutes. And, in the distance, Maria could see motorcycle patrols searching the hills, growing closer with each passing moment. She looked at the 3 children who had trusted her with their lives. Carmen, who had endured months of slavery but never given up hope of freedom. The boy and girl whose names she didn't even know, but who had suffered the same nightmare. They deserved better than the world had given them, and Maria was determined to make sure they got their chance at a real childhood. "When I say go, you run straight for that black car," she told them. "Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Those men will take you somewhere safe." Carmen looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "What about you?" Maria checked her pistol and realized she had no ammunition left. But in her equipment bag, she found something that might serve as a final distraction: 3 road flares from her emergency kit. "I'll be right behind you," she lied. The sound of motorcycle engines was getting closer. In another few minutes, the search parties would reach the cemetery and all chance of escape would be lost. Maria lit the first flare and threw it as far as she could toward the eastern side of the hill. The bright red light would draw attention away from their escape route. "Go," she shouted. The children ran like their lives depended on it, which they did. Maria lit the second flare and threw it in a different direction, then followed the children toward the waiting vehicle. Behind them, shouts erupted as soldiers spotted the flares and raced toward what they thought were the fugitives' positions. They were halfway across the open field when Maria heard the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle. Dirt kicked up near her feet, then again closer to the children. One of the motorcycle patrols had spotted them and radioed their position to a marksman. Maria lit her final flare, but instead of throwing it, she held it above her head like a signal beacon. The bright light would make her an obvious target, but it would also give the extraction team a clear visual on their location. The black SUV raced through the narrow mountain roads at speeds that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. But with Ramirez's forces in pursuit, careful driving was a luxury they couldn't afford. Maria gritted her teeth against the pain in her shoulder as every bump and turn sent fresh waves of agony through her wounded arm. The operative who had pulled her from the cemetery was a lean man with graying temples who introduced himself only as Collins. He worked efficiently to stabilize her wound while the vehicle bounced and swayed through the hills. "Bullet went clean through," he reported in a crisp British accent. "Missed the bone, but you're losing blood fast. We need to get you to a proper medical facility within the next 2 hours." Maria looked at the 3 children huddled together in the back seat. Carmen sat between the 2 younger kids, her arms protectively around them both. Despite being only 8 years old, she had instinctively taken on the role of their protector, probably because she had been at the school longer than the others. "What are their names?" Maria asked, nodding toward the other 2 children. "Miguel and Sofia," Carmen answered. "Brother and sister. They were taken from their village 2 months ago." The siblings were perhaps 6 and 7 years old, with the hollow-eyed look of children who had seen too much horror for their young minds to process. They hadn't spoken since the escape, but they clung to Carmen as if she were their lifeline to sanity. The SUV's radio crackled with urgent chatter. Collins listened to the reports with growing concern before translating for Maria. "Roadblocks are going up on all the major routes south. Ramirez has called in favors with corrupt police units in 3 provinces. They're treating this as a military operation now." Maria understood what that meant. Her rescue of 3 children had escalated into something much larger. By publicly humiliating one of the region's most powerful criminal leaders, she had essentially declared war on his entire organization. Ramirez couldn't afford to let her escape, because word of her success would encourage other rescue attempts and undermine his control. "How far to the border?" she asked. 60 kilometers by road, but the main crossing is already compromised." Collins pointed to a map spread across the front seat. "We're heading for an alternate route through the mountains. Old Smuggler's Path. Problem is, it's only accessible on foot." Maria looked at her wounded shoulder, then at the 3 exhausted children. A 60-kilometer hike through mountain wilderness would be challenging for healthy adults. For wounded people and traumatized kids, it might be impossible. "There has to be another way," she said. Collins shook his head grimly. "Every airstrip in the region is watched. Every road has checkpoints. The mountain pass is our only option." Their driver, a local man who knew the terrain, suddenly began speaking rapidly in Spanish. Collins translated. "He says there are vehicles behind us. At least 3, maybe more." Through the rear window, Maria could see dust clouds rising in the distance. Their pursuers were closing the gap, using superior numbers and local knowledge to predict their route. The SUV rounded a sharp curve and, suddenly, lurched to a halt. Ahead of them, a fallen tree blocked the narrow road. It was clearly a trap. The tree had been cut down recently, and the cut marks were too clean to be natural. "Ambush," Collins said quietly, already reaching for his rifle. But before he could take action, gunfire erupted from both sides of the road. The SUV's bulletproof windows spiderwebbed under the impact, but held for now. The children screamed and ducked low as bullets hammered against the armored vehicle. "Everyone out," Collins shouted. Into the trees. The driver was hit in the first exchange of gunfire, slumping over the steering wheel. Collins dragged him from the front seat, while Maria shepherded the children toward the tree line. Her wounded shoulder felt like it was on fire, but adrenaline kept her moving. They took shelter behind a massive oak tree as the ambush intensified. Maria counted at least 8 attackers, professional fighters who moved with tactical precision. These weren't random bandits. They were Ramirez's best soldiers, sent to ensure that none of the escapees lived to tell their story. Collins returned fire with his assault rifle, but their position was being flanked from both sides. "We can't hold here," he said between bursts of gunfire. "They'll surround us in minutes." Maria looked at the children and made a desperate decision. "Take Miguel and Sophia," she told Collins. "Get them to safety. What about you and the girl? Carmen knows these mountains. We'll find another way out." Collins understood what she was really saying. With her wounded shoulder slowing them down, the entire group would be captured or killed. By splitting up, at least half of them might have a chance. "I'll draw their fire," Maria continued. "Give you time to reach the high ground." Before Collins could object, Maria grabbed Carmen's hand and broke from cover, running deeper into the forest. As she had hoped, most of the attackers turned to pursue them, seeing the wounded journalist as the primary target. They crashed through the underbrush like wounded animals, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. Behind them, shouts and gunfire marked the positions of their pursuers. Maria's shoulder bled freely now, leaving a trail that would be easy to follow. After 10 minutes of desperate flight, they reached a steep ravine that cut across their path like a wound in the earth. The gap was perhaps 4 meters wide, too far to jump, especially for a child. There, Carmen pointed to a fallen log that spanned the ravine about 50 meters downstream. "We can cross there." But, as they approached the makeshift bridge, voices echoed from the forest behind them. Their pursuers were close, following the blood trail with professional efficiency. The log was slippery with moss and barely wide enough for one person. Maria went first, testing each step carefully. Halfway across, she heard Carmen gasp and looked back to see soldiers emerging from the trees. "Run!" Maria shouted. Carmen scrambled across the log just as the first shots rang out. Bullets splintered the wood inches from her feet, but she reached the far side safely. Maria was still crossing when a shot took out a section of the log behind her. The timber groaned and began to sag. She made a desperate leap for the far bank, landing hard on her wounded shoulder. Pain exploded through her entire left side, but Carmen helped pull her to safety just as the log collapsed into the ravine. The soldiers on the other side shouted in frustration, but they were temporarily stopped. The ravine extended for kilometers in both directions, and finding another crossing would take hours. "Come on," Carmen said urgently. "I know where we can hide." They climbed higher into the mountains, following animal trails that were barely visible among the rocks and scrub brush. Carmen moved with the confidence of someone who had grown up in these hills before being taken to the school. She led Maria to a small cave hidden behind a waterfall, a natural shelter that would be almost impossible to spot from below. Inside the cave, Maria finally allowed herself to examine her shoulder properly. The wound was worse than Collins had initially thought. The bullet had nicked an artery, and she was losing blood faster than her body could replace it. Without medical attention soon, she would lose consciousness and possibly die. "Senora, you're very pale," Carmen observed with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who had learned to assess medical emergencies. "I'll be okay," Maria lied. "We just need to rest for a while." But Carmen was smarter than that. She had seen enough wounded people at the school to recognize the signs of serious blood loss. "You need help," she said. "Real help." Maria pulled out the radio Father Miguel had given her, hoping it would still work in the mountains. After several tries, she managed to raise a weak signal. "Sanctuary, this is Phoenix," she whispered into the device. "Do you copy?" Father Miguel's voice came back faint and crackling. "Phoenix, we've been worried. What's your status?" "I'm wounded and losing blood. The package I was carrying is safe, but we're separated from the extraction team. Can you reach the alternate extraction point?" Maria looked at Carmen and then at the map in her equipment bag. The alternate extraction point was a small airstrip another 20 kilometers through the mountains. In her condition, it might as well have been on the moon. "Negative, Sanctuary. I don't think I can make it that far." There was a long pause. Then, Father Miguel's voice came back with surprising strength. Phoenix, help is coming. There are people who care about what you've done. The whole world is watching now. Maria didn't understand what he meant until Carmen tugged at her sleeve and pointed outside the cave. In the distance, she could see helicopters approaching, not military aircraft, but civilian helicopters with news station logos painted on their sides. The media had somehow learned about the rescue mission. Maria's photographs from inside the school must have been transmitted automatically by her satellite-enabled camera before she lost contact with the outside world. The images of children being forced to work in drug labs had created an international incident. "Senora," Carmen said excitedly, "look at your camera." Maria checked her equipment and realized that her satellite transmitter had been sending burst transmissions every hour, uploading everything she photographed to news servers around the world. The images from the school were already being broadcast on international television. The radio crackled again. "Phoenix, this is BBC News Helicopter Charlie 7. We have you on thermal imaging. Medical assistance is en route." Through the mouth of the cave, Maria could see the lead helicopter circling their position. A rescue basket was being lowered on a cable, operated by someone in medical scrubs. But they weren't the only ones who had spotted the helicopters. From their hiding place, Maria could see military vehicles racing along the mountain roads below, converging on the landing zone. Ramirez's forces were making one last desperate attempt to silence the witnesses to their crimes. "Carmen," Maria said urgently, "when that basket reaches us, you get in first. No arguments." The child shook her head stubbornly. "Not without you. Listen to me." Maria gripped Carmen's shoulders with her good arm. "Your mother died believing that someone would save you. Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing. Get in that basket and tell the world what happened at that school." The rescue basket touched down outside the cave just as gunfire erupted from the hillside below. Ramirez's soldiers were attacking the helicopter with everything they had, trying to bring it down before the rescue could be completed. Carmen looked at Maria one last time, tears streaming down her face. The soldiers who entered the cave found Maria slumped against the stone wall, barely conscious from blood loss. Their leader, a sergeant with facial scars that suggested he had survived many battles, approached her with his weapon drawn. Behind him, 3 other fighters maintained defensive positions at the cave entrance. "Where is the child?" he demanded in Spanish. Maria looked up at him through eyes that were struggling to focus. "Gone," she whispered. "Safe." The sergeant struck her across the face with the butt of his rifle. "You have caused us much trouble, journalist. Commander Ramirez wants to speak with you personally." But before he could order her transport, his radio began crackling with urgent messages. Maria couldn't understand all the Spanish, but she caught enough words to realize that something significant was happening in the outside world. The sergeant's expression changed as he listened to the reports. His confident demeanor gave way to uncertainty, then to what looked like fear. He barked questions into the radio, and the responses clearly weren't what he wanted to hear. "What's wrong?" Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew. The sergeant glared at her. "Your pictures. They are everywhere. Television, internet, newspapers around the world. Our operations have been exposed." Maria managed a weak smile. "Good." But the sergeant wasn't finished. "It doesn't matter. You will disappear, and in a few weeks, the world will forget. There are always new stories to distract people." He was probably right about that. Media attention was notoriously short-lived, especially for stories from remote regions that most people couldn't find on a map. But as they dragged her from the cave, Maria heard something that gave her hope, the sound of more helicopters approaching, lots of them. The sky above the mountain was filling with aircraft. News helicopters from a dozen different networks circled overhead, their cameras broadcasting live footage of the rescue operation. But, more importantly, Maria could see military helicopters in the distance, approaching fast with the markings of the National Army. Commander Ramirez had made a critical error. By trying to suppress Maria's story through violence, he had only made it bigger. The images of children being forced to work in drug labs had created such international outrage that even the corrupt government officials who normally protected his operations were being forced to act. The sergeant's radio crackled again with reports that made him curse violently. Maria caught fragments. Army units moving north, international pressure, politicians demanding action. Then came the transmission that changed everything. All units, this is control. Cease operations immediately. Repeat, all combat operations are suspended pending political negotiations. The sergeant stared at his radio in disbelief. But what about the journalist? Release her to the media immediately. Any harm to foreign nationals will result in full military intervention. Maria felt a laugh bubbling up despite her pain and exhaustion. The story had become too big to suppress. Carmen's testimony from the helicopter, combined with her photographs from inside the school, had created a media firestorm that no amount of violence could extinguish. 20 minutes later, she found herself being carried toward a Red Cross helicopter on a stretcher, surrounded by international journalists documenting every moment. The sergeant who had struck her was nowhere to be seen, having melted away into the forest along with his men. Dr. Sarah Williams, a British physician working with Doctors Without Borders, began treating Maria's shoulder wound as the helicopter climbed toward the safety of government airspace. "You're lucky," the doctor said as she worked. "Another hour, and you would have bled out completely. What on earth possessed you to attempt something like this alone?" "I wasn't alone," Maria replied, thinking of Carmen's courage and Father Miguel's assistance. "I had help from some very brave people." Through the helicopter's window, she could see the old school building where her ordeal had begun. Military trucks were surrounding the compound, and soldiers were leading handcuffed figures away from the buildings. The children's prison was finally being shut down. The helicopter touched down at a military hospital near the capital city, where Maria was immediately rushed into surgery. But before the anesthesia took effect, she managed to ask one crucial question. The children, Carmen, Miguel, and Sofia, are they safe? "They're fine," Dr. Williams assured her. "All three are receiving medical care at the children's hospital. They're going to be okay." Maria closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, finally, allowing herself to believe that her promise to Elena Vasquez had been kept. She woke up 2 days later to find her hospital room filled with flowers and her bedside table covered with newspapers from around the world. Every major publication had run some version of her story, and the photographs from inside the school were on front pages from New York to Tokyo. Her editor, Sarah Chun, was sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking older than Maria remembered. "You're an idiot," Sarah said without preamble. "You could have been killed." "I know," Maria replied. "How are the children?" "Carmen is being treated for malnutrition and chemical exposure, but she'll recover fully. The other 2 kids are in similar condition. Carmen has been asking about you constantly." Sarah handed her a manila envelope. "This came for you this morning." Inside was a child's drawing done in colored pencils. It showed 2 stick figures, one large, one small, standing together under a rainbow. At the bottom, in careful Spanish script, were the words, "Gracias, Señora Maria, for keeping your promise to my mama." Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she stared at the simple artwork. All the pain, all the danger, all the fear had been worth it for this moment. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The story has had consequences you probably didn't expect." Over the next hour, Sarah briefed her on everything that had happened while she was unconscious. The international outcry over the photographs had forced 3 governments to take action against drug trafficking operations in the region. Commander Ramirez himself had been arrested by federal forces, along with dozens of his lieutenants. But, perhaps most importantly, Carmen's testimony from the helicopter had led to the rescue of more than 200 other children from similar operations across the region. The little girl's courage in speaking out had saved hundreds of lives. "The UN wants to interview you," Sarah added. "They're talking about using your story as the centerpiece of a new anti-trafficking initiative." Maria nodded, but her attention was focused on the drawing in her hands. All the international recognition in the world couldn't compare to knowing that 3 children were sleeping safely tonight because she had kept a promise to their dying mother. A week later, she was strong enough to receive visitors. Carmen arrived with Miguel and Sofia, all 3 looking healthier than they had in the cave. They brought Maria another drawing, this one showing 4 figures standing together in front of what looked like a house with a white picket fence. "Is this your new home?" Maria asked in Spanish. Carmen nodded enthusiastically. "Father Miguel is helping us find families. Real families who will take care of us." And you? Maria asked. Do you have family to go to? Carmen's expression grew serious. My grandmother lives in America, in a place called Houston. Father Miguel says she's been looking for me since Mama, and I disappeared. Maria felt her heart swell with hope. After everything this child had endured, she might actually get the chance at a normal life that every kid deserved. What about you, Senora? Carmen asked. Will you go back to America too? Maria looked around her hospital room, at the flowers and newspapers documenting the impact of their story. She thought about her comfortable apartment in New York, her safe job covering political stories and social issues. Maybe, she said. But first, I think I need to write a book about a very brave little girl who helped save a lot of other children. Carmen's face lit up. A book about me? A book about all of us, Maria corrected. About keeping promises and being brave when it matters most. 3 months later, Maria stood in the arrivals area of Houston International Airport, watching as Carmen ran into the arms of her grandmother, Elena's mother. The old woman wept as she held her granddaughter, whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish. Carmen broke away from the embrace and ran back to Maria one last time. Will I see you again? She asked. Absolutely, Maria promised. I'll come visit when the book is finished. And you'll tell our story? The whole story, every word, Maria assured her. So that everyone knows what happened, and so it never happens again. As she watched Carmen walk toward her new life with her grandmother, Maria thought about Elena Vasquez's final words. Promise me you'll bring her home. The promise had been kept, but it had led to something much larger than either of them had imagined. The story of one mother's love and one journalist's determination had sparked an international movement that was still saving children around the world. Maria's shoulder would always ache when it rained, a permanent reminder of her 48 hours in hell. But every time she felt that pain, she would also remember the sight of Carmen rising towards safety in that rescue helicopter, and the knowledge that sometimes keeping a promise to one person can change the world for many others. The book she eventually wrote became an international bestseller. The foundation she established with the proceeds rescued more than 5,000 children from trafficking operations over the next decade. And every year on the anniversary of their escape from the school, Maria received a carefully drawn picture in the mail from Carmen, showing them together under a rainbow, keeping promises that mattered more than life itself. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was the message it sent to other mothers like Elena Vasquez, that there are still people in the world who believe a promise made to a dying woman is worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price. In a world that often seemed to have forgotten the meaning of courage, Maria Santos and Carmen Vasquez had reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful force on earth is simply one person who refuses to give up on another. Their promise had been kept, their story had been told, and their legacy would endure long after the headlines faded and the cameras moved on to other crises. Because in the end, the most important promises aren't the ones we make to governments or organizations or institutions. They're the ones we make to each other, in moments when hope seems impossible and love is the only weapon we have left against the darkness. Then, she climbed into the basket and gave the signal to lift off. As the child rose towards safety, Maria used her remaining strength to key the radio one final time. This is Phoenix, she said to the worldwide audience she knew was listening. The package has been delivered. The story has been told. Whatever happens to me now, the world knows the truth. The helicopter carrying Carmen disappeared over the ridge just as the first soldiers reached the cave entrance. Maria had no ammunition, no strength left to fight, and no hope of escape. But as she watched the aircraft carrying Elena's daughter toward freedom, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. She had kept her promise to a dying mother. The rest was up to the world. The sniper's next shot missed by inches. His fourth shot didn't miss at all. The bullet caught Maria in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through her left arm, but she could see that the children had reached the SUV safely. The extraction team was already bundling them into the vehicle. Carmen broke free from her rescuers and ran back toward Maria. Senora, get up, go, Maria shouted through gritted teeth. Get in the car. But Carmen reached her before the soldiers did, grabbing Maria's good arm and trying to pull her to her feet. For a moment, they looked at each other across the small space that separated life from death. In Carmen's eyes, Maria saw a reflection of her own determination, the refusal to give up on someone who had risked everything for her. The SUV's engine roared as the extraction team realized they were about to lose everyone if they didn't move immediately. One of the operatives jumped out of the vehicle and sprinted toward them, laying down covering fire that forced the approaching soldiers to take cover. With Carmen pulling and the operative pushing, they managed to get Maria to the SUV just as the first motorcycle patrol crested the hill. Bullets shattered the rear window as they accelerated away, but they were moving too fast for accurate fire. As the cemetery disappeared behind them, Maria pressed a field dressing against her wounded shoulder and looked at the 3 children she had promised to save. They were alive, they were free, and for the first time in months, they had hope in their eyes. She had kept her promise to Elena Vasquez, but the cost had been higher than she ever imagined. And their ordeal was far from over. Arlite, using skills she had learned during night exercises with Kurdish fighters in northern Iraq. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. Every sound could signal discovery and death. But somewhere ahead in the darkness was a little girl who had been waiting 6 months for someone to care enough to bring her home. The old school building appeared just before dawn, a 2-story concrete structure surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Guard towers at each corner were manned by soldiers with assault rifles, and Maria counted at least 6 patrol routes around the perimeter. Getting inside would require timing, luck, and a miracle. But as she watched the guards through her binoculars, Maria noticed something that gave her hope. The patrols followed a predictable pattern, and there was a brief window every 20 minutes when the rear wall of the school was unguarded. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. She checked her weapon one more time, counting the 15 rounds that represented her only chance of fighting her way out if everything went wrong. In the growing light of dawn, she could see movement inside the school building. Small figures moving past windows, too small to be adult soldiers. Carmen Vasquez was somewhere inside that building, along with dozens of other children who had been stolen from their families. Maria had promised Elena she would bring Carmen home, but as she studied the fortress-like school, she realized she might have to save them all. The sun rose blood-red over the hills as Maria prepared to keep the most dangerous promise of her life. The next morning, she loaded her jeep with supplies and began the drive north. At the last government checkpoint, a young soldier tried to warn her about what lay ahead. "Senora, please," he said in broken English. "Very dangerous. Many people go north, no come back." Maria handed him her press credentials and smiled with more confidence than she felt. "I'll be careful," she promised. As she drove past the checkpoint and into rebel territory, Maria whispered a prayer for Elena Vasquez and her lost daughter. She had no way of knowing that her promise to a dying woman was about to set in motion a chain of events that would test every skill she had learned in 2 decades of war reporting. In her rearview mirror, she watched the government checkpoint disappear behind a cloud of dust. Ahead of her stretched 20 miles of the most dangerous territory in the hemisphere, controlled by men who killed for pleasure and profit. Somewhere in that wasteland was a little girl who had been waiting 6 months for someone to care enough to bring her home. Maria pressed the accelerator and drove deeper into hell, carrying nothing but her camera, her weapon, and a promise she intended to keep.